Well, welcome everyone. Ja päivi ja puurispuahtin. Mun samenamale sigarietta tuomassa Tim ja Tim Frandy. Ja mun len leama stavi merkasami siidas lahtu dal kuektelot jahki. Vaikka mun shaattiin anashadabe nemi stavi Wisconsinis sapiria javri matekatis, mun perasle saami suomas ja ruottaske eren. Mun orundal maskujem nemis kosmon barkan Department of Central, Eastern and Northern European Studies davi rikalasha alko altmagid veaki professorin. So, good afternoon. Welcome, everyone. My name is Tim Frandy, and I am here today as the host and moderator of this event, and I've been a member of the North American Sámi community for more than 20 years. I'm originally myself from Anishinaabe lands on the south shore of Gitchigami, Lake Superior, but I am joining you from Musqueam lands in what's more commonly known as Vancouver, British Columbia, where I work here at the University of British Columbia as an assistant professor in Indigenous Nordic Studies. It's my great pleasure today to welcome you to this webinar, Ancestral Silence, Rediscovering Sámi Identity in the Norwegian-American Diaspora, presented by the Norwegian-American Historical Association. And I'm delighted to introduce to you today's speaker. Freia Titland is an award-winning multidisciplinary artist, an adjunct professor of philosophy, and the founder and director of the Divine Feminine Film Festival in New York City. Freia is currently completing her PhD in women's spirituality, where she's exploring how ritual can act as a means of spiritual and cultural reclamation for Sami-descended women in North America. Freia is presently a creative researcher in residence with Vision Lab Collective, where she is exploring dreams as a cultural and spiritual technology through the medium of film. Before we begin, I'll just note that we're going to be going for about 40 to 45 minutes with the main presentation, and following that we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes for any Q&A or discussion we'd like to have. So feel free at any point to put questions in the chat, and we'll just hold them until the end of the session and work through them as best we can. We'll be winding down shortly after the 1 hour mark with this talk. So without further ado, please join me in giving a metaphorical clapping warm welcome to Freia.
Oh, thank you so much. I don't think I've ever had such a wonderful introduction. Oh, here we are. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. And hello to everyone who's watching the recording. My name is Freia Titland, and I was raised in New York on Munsee Lenape land. I am now inhabiting the traditional territory of the Kickapoo peoples here in East Texas. And before I begin, I just want to dedicate my talk today to my Tante Elaine, who unfortunately passed away earlier this month. She was incredibly supportive of me, and I'm just so grateful for her, and I feel her presence with me today. So, I'm actually going to begin my talk today with a memory of mine. And this memory is from a warm summer day in 2025, not unlike the one many of us are experiencing today. When my alarm went off at 6 a.m., I groaned. I hadn't slept well, and I almost sent a text message to my dad to tell him that I couldn't make it to breakfast with his uncle, my great uncle. But my Tante Elsa had actually died that week, and I thought of how precious little time that we had with the people we loved. So sighing, I rolled out of bed, and I took myself off to a little diner on Staten Island in New York. And I smiled as my Uncle Ud, who insisted we call him Uncle Studley growing up, or Uncle Stud, told stories about how life had been going for him, who said what at church, and how his son was doing at work. I had been holding myself back from peppering him with questions all morning, but now, as he was almost done with his meal, I let my curiosity fly. I needed to know if he had information that I was looking for, information about our Sami heritage. You see, my Uncle Ud is my oldest living relative in this country and was born in Norway. So I asked him, "What's your earliest memory of Norway?" He sat back, quiet. Many seconds ticked by as he looked far off into the distance. And I thought for a moment that he would simply say that he doesn't remember. I didn't stump you, did I? No, no, he said. My first memory of Norway, I know what it is. Both me and my dad leaned forward. I thought he was going to say a memory of his mother, maybe a holiday or a birthday, school or a special event, but what he actually said caught my breath. I remember leaning out of the window as he and his siblings, looked out of the window at the night sky as it lit up. With northern lights, I asked. With Nazi bombs. I sat, stunned. My dad chuckled awkwardly. I worried I had just ruined breakfast, but my uncle didn't appear to think so. It's as if I opened up a long forgotten memory chest and the stories just spilled out. He said, I was maybe 3 or 4. We lived in Nappana, right above the fjord. We would know when the Germans were coming because we could see them from the ridge. They had to take the fjord in, and that would give us 30 minutes to prepare. We used to have a radio. The radio would give us updates about what the British were doing. If you were caught with a radio, they would shoot you. My father and his brother used to hide the radio outside under a pile of sticks in the woods. How old were you when you came to America? I asked him. Do you remember the journey over? Oh, yes. We sold our house to buy tickets on the ship out of Stavanger. Except our departure was delayed and we had to come over in January. I was 9. I turned 10 a few months after we arrived in New York. The North Sea in the winter was rough. The waves were massive. All of the passengers were sick, and it took us a few weeks longer to arrive than originally planned. But us kids had a blast. I don't know why, but we never got sick. We would go to the dining hall and be the only ones there. The waiters would give us anything we wanted. We never got to have ice cream, but we had so much of it on that trip. I discovered a great deal from this conversation. New things I never knew about my family. As I let my uncle recount stories from his life in Norway and his journey over to America uninterrupted, I learned that his parents had first emigrated after World War I, went back to Norway due to lack of work, and came back again after World War II, or during World War II. I also learned that our family was never supposed to stay in New York. We were supposed to go to Seattle or Alaska like the rest of our family had, out west. Indeed, his father's petition for citizenship listed his intent to become a resident of Seattle, Washington. He never made it there, however. This information piqued my interest further. Records indicate that the majority of Sami-descended peoples had originally settled in places like Seattle and Alaska. And in my present search for answers, it had always struck me how alone I felt growing up in New York with no one to talk to about my heritage. Even Norwegians were becoming increasingly harder to come by. I knew I had to press him a bit further. So I asked, was there music in your house growing up? Did your parents like to sing? As it turns out, both of my great-grandparents were quite musical and played many instruments. My dad chimed in at this point to recount how his grandmother would make up words when she was singing. She would ad-lib and say things like, Lola di Lola, when she didn't know the words. This is when my heart leapt. What I believe my father had just described was yoiking. Yoik is a traditional style of singing or chanting for the Sami people. A yoik recounts a person, place, feeling, and so forth, and calls that person or place into being. Yoiking is traditionally unaccompanied by instruments and often sung in wordless syllables. Indeed, yoik is a musical language of feeling. A yoik describes or evokes an emotion, a person, a landscape, an animal, or whatever the singer may choose. So I took a deep breath and I posed my next question to my uncle. I asked, what do you know about us being Sami? I've done some research, and our historical and genealogical records would suggest that we are. You see, I was nervous to ask this question. It felt really loaded, as if it carried the weight of my ancestors, religion, spirituality, colonialism, heritage, lost language, culture, and longing inside of it. A deep longing for a kind of confirmation of what I felt in my heart to be true. Part of me felt like my uncle would deny any knowledge of this part of our heritage. I don't really know why I felt that way, but I held my breath and I waited. I had been working up to this question all morning, and again, my uncle was silent for a few moments. And then he said, "The Sami live way up in the north, but we would see them on our travels. They live close to nature and they herd reindeer. They don't speak like Norwegians, you know. They speak like the people in Iceland. They sound like old Vikings." Then his eyes lit up. "You know, when I was young and we were still living in Brooklyn, a young married Sami couple came from Norway to stay with us for a week. They went to church with us before moving on out west. They wore the Sami dress and they spoke their language with my parents. Do you know if your parents knew them before they came to America?" A look I can't quite describe passed over his face, and he said, "No, I'm sorry. I was too young." The conversation turned. Memories. What do we remember? What do we know to be true? And what's the difference? My Uncle Ud was the second youngest of 6. He was only 9 when he came to America. My Tante Liv, the youngest, would most likely know even less. This is a problem many Sami descended people have. Alone, the scraps of information might not mean much. Together, it starts to paint a picture of a family that wore Norwegianization like a cloak as they entered America. Much later, I learned from a Sami scholar, Åsa Anderson Marti, that the reciprocity that took place in Brooklyn between my great-grandparents and that remembered Sami couple was a system known as the Verde system in the North Sami language. This reciprocal system was traditionally practiced between small farmers and semi-nomadic Sami peoples and acted as a form of relationality and community connection. Learning this word warmed my spirit, because across oceans, across time and space, my great-grandparents were still participating in a cultural system. This practice was a visible marker in an otherwise invisible identity. And here's my visible marker in my little Norwegian dress as a child. So let me pause a moment and move my little screen so I can see everything. So why am I doing any of this? Why am I looking for these visible markers within an invisible identity? Why did I force myself out of bed while cranky and tired and pepper my great uncle with questions over breakfast? Aside from familial, personal, and spiritual interest, I had other motivations for asking these questions to begin with. So as mentioned, I am currently a PhD candidate in women's spirituality. My dissertation is exploring how ritual can be used as a means of cultural and spiritual reclamation for Sami-descended North American women. Specifically, and I do apologize ahead of time, I've done my very best research for pronunciation, but I may get things wrong. So specifically, I'm utilizing Sami Voinjalash Abavieru, or spiritual heritage, and blending those practices and beliefs within contemporary frameworks. So not just to rebuild lost knowledge, but to generate new ways of knowing and being within a diasporic context. So let me explain this term a little bit before we lose what's going on. This term is suggested by a scholar named Konsta Kaikkonen, and it's suggested as a kind of umbrella term to cover what we might understand as Sami spirituality and to replace the phrase Sami religion, as Sami religious experience is incredibly vast and varied and cannot be boiled down into simplistic terms. Sami Voinjalash Abavieru offers a way to understand the continuity and adaptation of Sami spiritual practices over time. and here I'm quoting from Kaikkonen, used this way, this term would be an indigenous term used as an edict, one to cover the pre-missionary time, post-missionary ones, as well as the current interest in shamanism and Sami traditions within Sami communities, including contemporary forms of Sami Christianities. Using this term would emphasize continuity, as well as the fact that even if brought from the outside, the Sami have made different exogenous religious customs and traditions, such as Christianity and core shamanism, as part of their own abavieru, even though these traditions would not have been labeled as religious by the Sami themselves, end quote. So this term covers both scholarly definitions of religion without invoking non-Sami ideas about religion and spirituality. So to undertake this dissertation task, I'm approaching the work itself from within Sami philosophical, historical, cultural, and spiritual context as best I can as an American. I'm hyper aware of my positionality as an outsider, attempting to do memory and recovery work. So when thinking about how I would accomplish this dissertation work, I searched for ideas, terms, frameworks, cosmologies that would center Sami voices and knowledge systems. And to that end, I've settled on using what's known as the Lavu method, as pictured here, or Lavu, which is a Sami-specific research method that centers Sami knowledges, cosmology, and philosophies. This method was introduced to me via the writing of Yelena Porsanger and Iria Kari. So the Lavu was historically utilized by many nomadic Sami communities as a temporary shelter. Even today, Sami people use the Lavu as a shelter, as a meeting place, and for political and spiritual activism. Elena Helander and Karina Kylo tell us that the Lavu is the Sami university. It is there that knowledge is discussed and negotiated in connection with specific working situations. In other words, epistemological truth is generated and renewed by storytelling, discussions, evaluation of previous activities, memorized experiences and phenomenon, and through intuition. So the Lavu acts as a source of knowledge production and continuation, and its usage in my research as a methodological approach acts as a metaphor for the creation of Sami Voinyalash Abavieru within North American contexts. So the Lavu is a movable dwelling and a center of knowledge transmission. And as a Sami descended North American with various other interwoven identities, I have migrated from my ancestral homelands, and I'm seeking to reclaim the knowledge that has been lost. So one of the methods that sits within the framework of the Lavu method that I'm leaning on is inspired by the Sami idea or philosophy of moitalit, the Lula Sami word used to denote storytelling, retelling, and remembering. The phrase matsa ya moitalit refers to the idea of bringing something back, coming back, or returning through the act of storytelling or remembering. So for Sami in North America, I argue that moitalit represents the reclaiming of our ancestral heritage and spiritualities by recovering and sharing our stories and experiences. In the sharing of our family histories, we remember and weave new futures together. But it's not enough to think and write about theories when doing diasporic recovery work. These theories and ideas should be put to practice. And so I practice my version of moitalit in that diner on Staten Island with my great uncle. I allowed his storytelling, his memories, his telling to transmit knowledge to me across time and space. And apparently this was a difficult process for him, as I found out a few weeks later from my father that he didn't really like answering my questions, even though at the time it seemed like he was enjoying the telling of the tale, which of course is a bummer. But that uncomfortability, I think, speaks to something bigger and older, I think something deeper. There's a great deal of unknowing, of not remembering, within Sami peoples and within Sami descended North Americans. There are many reasons for this unknowing, but to understand why so many of us are unsure or have a difficult time tracing our roots, we need to go back in time so we can form an understanding of why so many of our ancestors, my family included, crossed into Ellis Island as Norwegians only. So in essence, this is a talk about rediscovering identity. So in a way, this is a talk about memory. what's been forgotten, suppressed, erased, and how we can do the work of remembering and building towards a new future. I'm going to begin, as I already have, by looking back so that we can have a bit of context around why our ancestors would have suppressed their identities. I'll then highlight some historical and contemporary movements that have aided in the resurgence of Sami identity, reclamation in North America, and finally, I'll offer a pathway for those who wish to explore their own identity from a culturally informed place. It's also important to mention that my approach to this conversation is deeply informed by my own perspective as a Norwegian American, and that means there's a very large swath of perspectives that I won't be attending to. My hope is that you find something valuable in our talk today, and I'm happy to answer any questions as best I can at the end. So how'd we get here? So beginning in the late 1800s, Norwegian and Swedish authorities implemented harsh assimilation policies designed to, quote unquote, civilize the Sami. These measures targeted nearly every aspect of Sami life, from banning traditional religious practices, placing children in boarding schools that erase Sami language and history, restricting land ownership to those who abandoned Sami names, and more. Borders were closed to sidas, or family units, preventing families from following reindeer migrations and seasonal cycles. And over time, these policies led to forced relocations, the fragmentation of families, and the permanent severing of many Sami people from their ancestral lands and loved ones. In her book, The Rocks Will Echo Our Sorrow, The Forced Displacement of the Northern Sami, Ellen Anna Laba collects and recounts many stories from those who experienced the forced relocation of the early 20th century and its aftermath. One story she shares comes from a woman named Anna Maria, who recalls the memory of the land where she spent her summers. The realm of the sea, she calls it. Anna Maria's granddaughter tells the author that her grandmother wanted to go back to Norway. She refused to speak of the displacement, but one day, Anna Maria escaped from the nursing home where she was living, and they eventually found her loaded up with a bag and a walking pole. According to her granddaughter, while she never talked about why she left Norway, she always begged to be taken back, quote, to go home. The author asks at the beginning of her book, the author asks questions at the beginning of her book that echo in my own bones. Just where do I belong? What is my home? Do I have the right to mourn for a place that has never been mine? As we can see for people like Anna Maria, these places once were their homes, and some have never been able to return. As these policies continued to be enforced across Nordic borders, culture, language, and certain spiritual practices were demonized. Soon it became taboo to speak of these practices and further still, to identify oneself as Sami. Why face persecution when one could blend in and benefit from their newly adopted identity instead? Indeed, many people chose to pass as Norwegian, for example, to avoid racism, persecution, and the loss of livelihood. We see how that played out for the main character in the 2016 film Sami Blood, directed by Amanda Cornell. If you haven't seen it, check it out. Because of all this, cultural practices and language became lost, spirituality was hidden, and it would take many years before younger generations would step into an activist spotlight with the hopes of reclaiming these losses. As Finnish scholar Karina Kailo argues, we are now aware that one of the colonial techniques for destroying Native people's own expressions of spirituality and power, their cultural property, has been to destroy their symbols, their language, and or to rename their realities by recasting their sacred objects or deities in negative terms. Material dispossession and discursive denigration thus go hand in hand. So it is no wonder, by the time my grandfather, Cora, and his family emigrated to the United States for the last time in 1951, they solely identified as Norwegian. And there he is, and my grandmother too. So we need to talk about the words Norwegianization and Americanization. There may be many people here today that have felt the effects of Americanization within their own families. If your parents refuse to speak Norwegian with you, or your grandparents with their children so they could be proper Americans, then you will understand my meaning. My family and countless others experience both of these processes. Norwegianization refers to the process of forced assimilation and erasure of Sami languages, customs, traditional livelihoods, and more. While this erasure continues to reverberate amongst Sami communities, the time period between the 1850s and the 1980s saw the most significant impact of Norwegianization in all the ways previously mentioned. Americanization, on the other hand, refers to the adoption, forced or otherwise, of American customs, values, and language that many immigrants experience so that they may assimilate into American society. Historically, this process often came at the partial or total expense of immigrants' own cultural practices, including languages, foods, and social traditions. These two processes are incredibly important considerations when thinking about how one's identity is able to become invisible, hidden, neglected, or forgotten about in a diaspora context. For new immigrants from the US to the US from Norway, who may have just spent countless years being punished or ostracized for their Sami identities, stepping off the boat at Ellis Island is an opportunity to be whoever you want to be. Now, it needs to be acknowledged that there is a stunning photo of a Sami woman at the Ellis Island Museum of Immigration. She wears a gakti, the traditional dress, and stares directly into the lens of the camera. Ellen Marie Jensen, a Sami American author, tells us that another Sami woman who she knows describes this woman in the photograph as, quote, frightened and proud. So there are clearly those who came here full of pride in their identity. But can the same be said for everyone? Countless firsthand, anecdotal, and scholarly stories tell us otherwise. Sometimes it's easier to just go along with your head down if it means survival. I don't know what my own family felt as they passed through that liminal space that is Ellis Island, where they entered with the name Rasmussen and left with the name Titland, an unfortunate byproduct of cultural misunderstandings and language barriers, and one that made my teenage years quite difficult. While Americanization has a more direct impact on my own life and upbringing, Norwegianization has led to something that has made it difficult for those of us on the journey of trying to learn more about who we are and where we came from. And it's called the Sami silence. Scholar Siv Ellen Craft describes the Sami silence as a practice of being private and rarely talking about one's spirituality, customs, and experiences pertaining to boarding schools and assimilation policies publicly. The Sami silence has many layers to it. Some of it is a literal silence due to the lack of knowledge around sacred landscapes, religious and cultural practices, and more. Much of it refers to the fear surrounding forced assimilation and the consequences many Sami people faced. Kraft says that this term is complex, quote, denoting matters that are not talked about or that are only talked about in private moments. It refers to collectives rather than individual matters and to inherent wounds from the past as a result of missionary and forced assimilation and the stigmatizing and even demonizing of Sami traditions that they brought about, end quote. The Sami silence, therefore, can sometimes be a barrier to obtaining knowledge about one's cultural practices and their past, and crucially, to learning the truth about one's identity as a Sami person. But there are many activists, scholars, and community members who have broken their silence to advocate for equal rights, land and water protection, and the preservation of Sami culture. In 2018, for example, Sami activists used ceremony performance and spiritual activism to protect a sacred South Sami mountain from a proposed power plant that was going to be built at the base of that mountain. Sami artists, performers, activists came together at a meeting between the church, the local communities, developers, and politicians to perform using music, speech, traditional chants, and more. And according to Siv Ellen Craft, this kind of demonstration showed that the desire to protect the sacred site was more powerful than the long-held tradition of silence and provided Sami peoples with a tangible process of cultural and spiritual revitalization and knowledge. Breaking the silence certainly didn't stop in 2018, but it also didn't start then either. People began breaking the silence many years prior, alongside another environmental threat. These moments of awakening, if you will, sparked a process of rediscovering for many people in Sápmi, but also people here in North America. There are many notable events and movements that could be discussed, but due to time, I will mention two. The first is the Alta conflict. This protest put Sápmi and Sámi people on the global stage, letting the world know that they still existed and that they were not being treated fairly. In 1968, plans were presented for a hydroelectric power station along the Alta Guavda-Giadnu River on the Norwegian side of Sápmi. This power station would have submerged an entire village. While this particular project was scrapped, the idea for a power station endured, culminating in an altered proposal by the Norwegian government in the mid-1970s. This was met with resistance from Sámi in what became known as the Alta conflict. The protest consisted of rallies, sit-ins on government property, the erection of a lavvu on parliament lawns, and a hunger strike. The Alta protests received global attention, including from indigenous groups worldwide. Unfortunately, the protests came to an end when three activists preemptively detonated a homemade device intended for a bridge leading to the construction site. Nila Sombi lost an eye and an arm, and John Rare Martinson would later lose his life in a suspicious snowmobile accident. While these events were tragic, the Alta protests were a catalyst that propelled many Sámi people to break a cultural silence surrounding their identity and values. The Alta conflict sparked a new Sámi movement in the Nordic countries that inspired artists, scholars, politicians, and activists to redefine what Sáminess was and to fight for self-determination. These new ideas of Sáminess would reach us here in North America in the 1990s with the North American Sámi movement. According to the newly named Sámi Circle North America, the early 1990s saw the spark of a movement to reclaim Sámi identity in North America in which, quote, Sámi began to find each other and learn more about their history and culture and to reconnect with relatives in Sápmi. Many of you may remember when Baiki, the International Sámi Journal, was first published in 1991. Baiki's first publication sparked a reawakening among Sámi-descended North Americans and has subsequently led to a wide range of cultural activities, least of all, the establishment of the Pacific Sámi CRV, and now a library collection of Sámi books at the University of Minnesota, I believe. Additionally, the academic discourse born of this movement contributed to a larger conversation regarding Sámi peoples' continued fight for self-determination in our ancestral countries, as well as to a broader discourse regarding Indigenous rights and Indigenous knowledge systems, retention, and production. This conscious attempt to learn about the Sámi past and reconnect with its artistic, spiritual, and ecological norms in the present, despite the sometimes sizable disjunctures and lapses that have occurred, contributed to identity building for Sámi descendants in diaspora. By recovering this cultural community, Sámi-descended North Americans assist in the continuation and endurance of Sámi language, culture, spirituality, and history of Sámi peoples. Now, I was born in 1991, the same year as Baiki's first publication, and 1 year after Norway ratified the ILO Convention 169, officially recognizing Sámi people as Indigenous peoples. As I was writing this, I wondered to myself, did my grandfather know? Was he even aware of this movement in America that seemingly only took place way west of New York? Did he even care? What benefit would it have been to him? My grandfather is the young boy in the middle with his long tie there. And those are his brothers and sisters and parents there. Only recently, I began to ask myself, why was only I, given Sámi dolls and mere scraps of information? I have more cousins than I can count on my fingers and toes, both here and in Norway. I think I have some new cousins who have been recently born whose names I do not know. We'll have to learn. Surely someone else could have done this cultural recovery work. Why did you leave it to the introvert? Why was I left the clues that would lead me to what sometimes feels like a burden, a difficult task better suited to a master puzzle maker? I don't have the answers, but sometimes I think maybe he just wanted somebody, anybody, to know. Know what exactly? That the furthest I've been able to trace my grandfather's family, since the records are of women, excuse me, have them living on islands such as Radøy and Saibo on the west coast of Norway. That my DNA test places our family further back, further north. That when I look into the eyes of his great grandmother in a black and white photograph, that I just know. What does it mean to return? What does it mean to break the silence? Surely that looks different for different people. For me, it's a spiritual experience. For others, maybe it's political, familial, cultural, historical. Maybe it's everything combined. Saving the sacred South Sami mountain was certainly an event that combined all of the aforementioned elements. The unprecedented act of public spiritual activism created a container through which dialogue, performance, ceremony, and art could act as pathways for spiritual and cultural reclamation for Sami people. The desire to protect the mountain was greater than the fear of backlash or criticism from the wider community. This tradition of silence that I've been speaking about, coupled with the very real effects of harmful state policies, has contributed to how North Americans have struggled to uncover and define their own cultural lineages. What would it have taken for my ancestors to supersede their own silence? I will never know. It's now too late to ask my pop what any of this means. When you're young, you think you have all the time in the world with all the people you love. And unfortunately, it wasn't until my grandparents had already passed away that I started to get curious about who I was. Now, I spend a great deal of time thinking about family stories, connections, memories, and how those memories impacted how I understand myself and my identity. So before I continue, I'd like to invite you into a practice of your own remembering. Across many cultures, recounting stories is one of the ways we preserve memory, pass on values, make meaning across generations. The stories we inherit and the ones we continue to tell often become part of how we understand ourselves and our place in the world. And we have so many people here today, so we won't be able to share all of these. But I just want to leave you with these reflection questions. And maybe if you feel comfortable, you put a few words or phrases into the chat, or maybe you just take them with you and think about them as you go. I believe they've been put into the chat, so you can see them there. Every time we remember, recount, and listen to one another's stories, we're participating in a practice that helps carry memory forward. My own question, my own journey rather, began with questions like these. So I started reading, as one does, and in reading about Sami people and Sami culture, I found it very easy to get excited about being a part of a group of people who are often spoken about using terms like exotic, unique, indigenous, shamans, reindeer herders, the far north. That sounds very mystical, right? But this romanticization and exoticization of Sami people was a trap that young and impressionable Freya fell into. And seeing the activism, hearing the yoiking, learning about shamanism, reindeer herding can be very exciting and healing for people who are attempting to break the silence in their own families and reconnect to their roots. But there are some important considerations to be had. And these considerations became very present for me in my own life. And I'd like to tell you about that experience with one more memory share. So in 2015, I saw an event flyer at a local women's community center in Brooklyn where I was a member. They were promoting an Indigenous women's gathering where there would be discussion, story shares, and a collective ritual. I remember how my excitement mingled with my apprehension. I had just begun exploring my Sami identity, and this event felt serendipitous. Deep down, however, I believed I wasn't the target audience for the event organizers. As a white, mixed identity, Sami descended woman living thousands of miles away from her ancestral homelands, on the lands of other displaced indigenous people, I was and am still keenly aware of the privilege I carried in my body. Being mindful of the space I would take up in a place meant for indigenous women who were most likely not Sami, I wrestled with whether or not I had the right to attend. Eventually, I forced myself out of the door and attended an event that would trigger my search for my own identity as a means to reclaim and express it. The word ritual in the event ad is what really forced my hand. I was a young woman living in New York City who enjoyed women's circles and goddess gatherings and witchy events. Ritual was the main action through which I expressed my spiritual identity. But I didn't know anything about indigenous ritual, or at least I thought I didn't. As I walked through the doors of that women's community center on that dark, rainy, and cold November evening, I was confronted with the fact that there was much work to be done in my own beloved women's ritual spaces. Why? I discovered that many of them were appropriating a number of indigenous practices. Now, this was a significant blow. I was young, eager, I was desperate for sisterhood. The women's spaces I found myself in felt feminist, diverse, full of ancestral wisdom. These spaces felt safe, comforting, affirming. And upon listening to those women speak about the co-option, appropriation, and exploitation of their cultural and spiritual practices, I saw that many of the rituals I had been lovingly participating in were potentially causing great harm. So instead of turning away from the words of those women, I decided to lean in and learn. This affront to my perceived culturally inclusive and ancestrally informed practices was actually the spark that lit the match. Where were my practices? What did my ancestors believe? What does ritual even mean? Just how much has been lost, and how much of what remains can be authenticated? And why don't I know? Who does know? These were questions I began to wrestle with as I began an exploration into my own identity, cultural history, and spirituality. I was raised in a mixed heritage, mixed religion, middle-class family in New York. My mother's father was a Catholic deacon. My father's father was a born-again Christian elder. I always knew I was Irish and Norwegian. While I never felt particularly connected to the faith systems I was raised in, I felt very, very Norwegian. Pop said a Norwegian prayer before meals and sang in Norwegian with his brother while my grandmother made Norwegian meals and bought us Norwegian sweaters. I wrote my school essays on being Norwegian, and I even won Miss Norwegian Heritage 2010 in Brooklyn. Yes, I did. I got to be in the parade and everything. Everything about us was Norwegian. But I was also gifted a lifelike doll with blinking blue eyes that was dressed in Sami clothing with reindeer hide boots. My grandfather had a reindeer hoof thermostat that hung outside the front door. The thermostat has since stopped working, but I still have it. When I was young, I didn't know that my doll was wearing a gakti or that the reindeer thermostat was adorned with anything culturally significant. I thought it was all Norwegian, because how would I know? Looking back with informed eyes, I can see how the currents of suppression and erasure ran directly into my father and his siblings. Norwegianization became Americanization, as even the Norwegian language was purposefully not taught. The children of my grandparents are firmly American, but with a deep love and longing for a home they were not born to, just like me and so many others who have begun the slow process of what author and professor Thomas A. Dubois calls recovered continuity. My story is not unique. There are many Sami-descended peoples who are on the path of recovering their culture and practicing cultural continuity through the unearthing of lost heritage. But as we embark on this path, we have to pause and consider our approach. Can you appropriate and misrepresent what you consider to be your own culture? Yes, you can. In my desire to be connected to women in spiritual community, I rushed in headfirst, grabbing up everything I could. I wanted to feel connected to something older than myself, to something alive and vibrant and female forward. It made me feel whole. In our desire and excitement to reconnect to our Sami ancestry, it can be very easy to romanticize a living culture. And like any culture, the Sami are made up of various groups, languages, customs, religious identities, and more. Indigenous peoples are not a monolith, and when embarking on your research journey, it is important to remember that there is a long legacy of harm, mistreatment, misunderstanding, misrepresentation, erasure. The Sami silence exists for painful reasons. So when you begin your own research process, it is important to remember that and to not expect others to simply give you the answers. It's not another person's job to have all those answers, and you may receive some pushback, some roadblocks, and feedback that may not feel so great, especially when you're coming from a well-intentioned place. So I've created a bit of a loose checklist, a working checklist for those who are seeking to do this kind of ancestral connection and recovery work. This checklist, for lack of a better word, centers Sami cultural sensibilities. In other words, it asks you to operate from a culturally informed and sensitive place as you embark on your journey. Our ancestors may have experienced harsh government policies, forced language loss, Norwegianization policies, violent schools, relocation, forced or otherwise. But here in North America, we have not. And therefore, we are in a unique position where we have the privilege of looking back, selecting what interests us, and taking it as our own. This checklist asks us to be a little more mindful in our approach. Read from Sami people, scholars, cultural bearers, community members, popular literature. Consume Sami media from Sami people, music, movies, art. Pick up a Sami word book and learn some phrases, even though it's hard, even for me, where each language group comes from and why some languages are extinct. Keeping language alive is important. Research Sami art, handicrafts, clothing. Be mindful of who you purchase from. Gaktis are similar to bunads in the sense that each stitch tells a story of where a person is from. Location is important. Donate to important causes if you can. Share about them if you can't. Sami people are still at the forefront of environmental issues in Sapmi and beyond. They need our help and support, not just our information extraction. Learn about the many spiritual traditions of the Sami people. Don't simply make assumptions about what those are. Social media can sometimes be a great place to start, but it should not be the only place where you learn. And take this knowledge and apply it to your own life. Where can you volunteer in your own communities? Where can you protect the environment, advocate for social justice issues, help to preserve or share cultural knowledge? While our ancestral legacy might have begun elsewhere, we now live wherever we live, and our communities are important. None of this learning is easy. It takes effort and the willingness to sometimes be wrong and uncomfortable. For me, it comes with both sadness and joy. Sadness, knowing that I no longer have the ability to ask my grandfather about our history. Joy, because I know that there is a wealth of resources available to me. I'd like to leave you with a hopeful idea for the future. This idea of reweaving the fragments of our identities back together again already exists within a Sami context. The Lula Sami word yakaswargya means the point where different branches of a river become entwined once again. It represents a metaphor for cultural recovery for Sami descended peoples. And speaking for myself, immigration paved the way for multiple cultural identities to take shape within my family tree. Remembering and retelling our stories, breaking the silence, can help us all return to the source of the river. Thank you. And a couple of sources that were used. And I will stop share. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Freya. I see that there's some questions and comments that have started to filter into the chat. We've got about 15 minutes or so where we can have some conversation. And if you're watching, please feel free to share. If you use the chat feature and address it to the hosts and panelists, we'll all be able to see it. And I suppose, start directing some of these questions and comments towards you. There's some lovely compliments. So proud of you, Freya, and just so grateful to be here. I hear everything you say. I'm on a similar journey. Thank you for your work. But there's one comment that maybe you'd like to respond to that I see. I won't share names in case people want to remain anonymous in this. One attendee writes, when I asked my now deceased aunt if my great grandmother was Sami, she empathetically said no, but it was obvious in her look. Years later, 23andMe verified my Asiatic roots, and she said no with a note of disgust. Um,
Yeah,
Responses,
that's tough.
thoughts.
Yeah, thank you for that share. And thank you for the work of asking the uncomfortable questions. You know, it goes back to that sense of uncomfortability, right? The Sami silence came about because of a response to these harsh policies that were forced upon people. And many people, older generations, who might have known that they were Sami, but chose to completely adopt a new identity, Swedish, Finnish, Norwegian, otherwise, right? Um, People were mistreated, judged, left out for being Sami. There were very real consequences for identifying oneself as Sami. Um, some of them quite violent. And so fear is a very real factor in how one chooses, if they ever choose at all, to take a look at their identity. Um, Fear, as many of us probably know, can often present itself as many other things: anger, disgust. While I can't speak specifically for how your aunt might have been feeling in that moment, if someone grows up in a culture of repression and negative thoughts and feelings about a particular identity, to then be accused of it, I'm not saying you did that. I'm thinking about the fear. I'm thinking of what that person might have felt like, um, can be a very scary thing, and it could feel dangerous and threatening. Um, and I wonder about how much of that impacted her emphatic no response to you.
There's another question, and this one is a bit more straightforward. Do you have an ancestor who is also named Freya, or are you the one and only Freya in your family?
So what's really funny about that is I have like long, long records. I wish my father was nearby so we could whip the book out. I have not found another Freya, but I don't know. I may be the first in this line. Haven't found another one. And it used to be that there weren't other people named Freya. And it was only maybe like 10 years ago that I met a small child named Freya, and I went, oh my God. I think, shows like Vikings and such really popularized the naming.
Another question: how can we learn more about Freya's work? I
Oh
would
gosh.
love to read your dissertation.
Oh, thank you. So that is a work in progress in and of itself. I'm actually working with some other women at this moment, and we've been putting together this thing, and we're actually going to be doing that together in a couple of weeks. What I do in the meantime, I do stuff like this. I presented with the International Society for Mythology. Um, there's a couple of things I do. So I do rituals and myth and folklore and a spirituality based. Yes, thank you for linking that collection. Fabulous. And so I do some public talks and presentations, and but the dissertation itself is a work in progress, but it will absolutely be publicly available. I hope to turn over any findings and information to the general public when that happens. I do have a website and I do have an email, and you are more than welcome to email me at any time. Just freya.titland@gmail.com.
Another question from the chat. My family is not comfortable discussing the information I have found in this journey. How do we find a community of people who are willing to have these conversations? Do you have a suggestion regarding how to find others on this journey? And is there a group who meets to discuss?
Sure. So I do know of the Pacific Sami CRV. They do a Facebook group. They have a membership tiers. I think when you are a member, they also have some language learning videos. They do a lot of in-person events and host people from Sapmi have come over and have been hosted in this way. Um, there are other groups and organizations. I believe someone is here from, I want to call it the Sami Cultural Center of North America, but it just got its new name and now I've put my notebook away. I think it's Sami Circle North America. There are those organizations. I would reach out to them. I would join their Facebook groups. There's other Facebook groups, you know. That's why I said social media could be a great place to start. It shouldn't be where you stop, but it could be a great place to find community. Um, and, maybe Tim can attest to this as well. If you read the work of researchers and scholars, they are often happy to talk to you about the work that they're doing. If you send them an email and say, hey, I read this really great article and I love this and I'd like to know more about that. Um, can you point me in a particular direction? And I know as someone whose work feels quite niche in the broader landscape of academia that if I got an email like that, I'd say, yes, hello. Oh my God, you read my stuff. Thank you. So that's also an option as well. But I do understand how isolating it can sometimes feel, especially when you don't grow up knowing or even knowing what to ask exactly. So the first step is to just reach out and try, and someone will answer.
There's a few more comments here saying, excellent presentation, thank you. And another one saying, thank you so much for the presentation. I've been crying since you shared your first story. You are a beautiful storyteller.
Oh, thank you.
Um, and I see another one in the chat. The eugenics climate in the early 20th century is important to study to understand the inherited taboos many of us are navigating. Is there any, would you like care to respond to this at all?
I can respond a little bit. The individual who the comment is from, I know, knows a great deal about that topic. Um, there are, it's difficult. The one thing I'll say in response to that I feel well informed enough to say is that it's not enough and to look at photos of your family and think, well, they look like that could be a really sort of difficult, uncomfortable line to go down. There should be more research and study. And to that point, it is correct. There are a lot of interwoven different layers of why people may also not wish to identify. And some of that is racial stigma, and some of that is something that someone feels within themselves. And that is an important conversation. One I don't feel incredibly confident having in this moment, but one I am aware of and should be looped into that conversation as well.
I see another question here. It's about a bit of a more sensitive topic, in fact, but one that
Okay.
people do address, right, is the sort of stereotypical Sami appearance. And so the question is that I see a great variety in the way people appear who identify as Sami from people whose appearance is more like Inuit to blonde or dark hair Norwegians. Could you comment on like the so-called Sami look and what it has meant and means, both I suppose from a Sami and more colonial perspective to Sami people?
Sure. So again, that's not exactly my area of focus, but obviously something that comes up in the research. I think the Sami look is an inherited colonial ideology of placing people into different groups based on what they look like. And you could take what I just said and apply it to a bunch of people in a bunch of places all over the place, right? Um, there were a lot of practices that meant to ostracize and other Sami people, and how they look was looped into that. horrible things like the size of their skull and, making fun of the way people walk and what their legs look like and, how that correlates to IQ. And so there's a very long thread of looking at people's physical appearance, using it as a way to ostracize, and therefore suggest that people who look like this are not as good as or not as smart as people who look like this instead. Um, Again, I know that there are a lot of people on their path of rediscovery that will look at photos of their family and think there is the Sami look. Especially early on in my own path of discovery, I did the same thing. I feel comfortable admitting that because I've learned a great deal since then, since my early journey. Um, and so again, I caution by saying don't just rely on people's appearances. You have to go a step further and see what you can track down. That's what I can say about that.
Another question in the chat is about DNA. So, how helpful and harmful can DNA tests be in this type of genealogical journey?
I think it can help maybe place your family in a particular place or a region, an area where you can then begin to do that focus. Um, I don't, I have a little bit of a hard time with, I was going to say the notion of DNA. That's not what I mean. I have a hard time with quantifying someone's identity solely based on how much percentage of their blood suggest they are this thing. There are a lot of other factors at play: culture, language, location. There's a very large scholarly debate around um, whether or not you can identify as Indigenous, for example, if you are not living and operating within the lands where your family comes from. Um, that's something to consider. And so when it comes to DNA, I think it could be a guidepost for where your family may be from, but I don't think that it should be the be all end all of your investigation or how you identify.
We have a few more minutes. If there are any more questions or comments for the chat, I had one myself. I
Please.
was wondering if we could go back to the idea of memory a little bit, which you brought up
Sure.
so compellingly and importantly. Um, I'm being an academic, right? I read a lot of
Please.
theory, and
Please.
I think about this field called critical heritage studies a
Sure.
lot, and how a lot about 20 years ago or so, there were a lot of people who were writing about heritage and saying, heritage is not like real. It's kind of something that we make up in the present as a way to understand the past. And so we're like opting and selecting, and it's almost a way kind of tethered to nostalgia or longing for a more authentic past, and every time in history is equally authentic, right? But like at the same time, like I know personally I've always been a little bit suspect about this idea because memory is important. Where we come from is really important. Understanding why we feel the way we feel in our own experiences and these little things like the Sami silence, which can be inherited through generations, is important on understanding who we are and how we communicate and how we experience the world. So for you though, I'm wondering how you understand memory in terms of heritage, and is this kind of just the same vanity project that exists all over, an immigrant experience, or is there something else going on potentially because of the political, this centuries of political oppression?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Um, it's one that I'm constantly investigating and interrogating, you know, especially because I'm involving myself in my research, which I originally did not wish to do. I said, I don't want to center myself and think about myself. That's no, that's not good. Um, but was gently nudged by my advisor to include my experiences in this. And it's also one of the reasons why I made sure to involve other people as well. Um, when I think of memory work, I do think of the things that we inherit within our bodies. I also think of the stories that we tell. And for me, I view memory work as a path towards healing. Yes, there are all of these political and social things that are involved in instances like the Sami silence, for example. But on a personal or community level, I have found that in remembering for anyone, not just Sami descended North Americans, but for any group of people, any family, that remembering creates this process of healing. And in that process of healing, we can develop more methods for self-trust, for self-determination, and more pathways for creating new knowledge for future generations to come. And I think that in order to do that, we first have to remember. And so, I mean, maybe in that sense, it's a little bit of a vanity project sometimes, probably. I definitely am concerned with my own healing and where my family is from. But also, this sort of goes back, which is why I included the story about the women and the women's circle and those things, because they are incredibly healing. They are healing spaces, not just from my own telling, but science backs it up as well, and other studies and avenues back up this idea of when we come together and we share and we remember and we pass on information, we heal ourselves and we heal one another. And when we do that, my hope, my belief, is that we can spread that out to more communities. Um, yeah, it's my present working of this. And I'm sure that will shift and change and expand as I continue to do the work. But yeah.
Fantastic. There's just a few more comments I can look through and read out for the group. DNA tests are like social media; they're a place to start.
Yeah.
Another person contributes generational transmission of trauma and epigenetics also play important parts, I believe. I'm assuming this is in terms of the memory work
I
and
believe so.
this legacy. During World War II, the Sami were forced to lead the Germans over harsh winter terrain. The Sami outskied the Germans and withstood the cold when the Germans could not. An excellent and enlightening presentation. Thank you so much for making this opportunity available to us. And finally, controversial as it may be, one of my Sami grandmothers visited me in dreams before I had any real context about any of the elements of those dreams, such as a lavu, a komsio palo, one of these, and the images led me to the family history through time and meaningful coincidences. I'm still learning.
Well, I'll make a brief comment on that. There is an article whose author escapes me right now, but it is called Gifts of Dreams. Um, and dreaming is very much a traditional Sami practice. So don't call it controversial. That's the end to the research start. So, thank you, everyone. Thank you for your kind comments and for being here.
With that said, I think that this is a good place to wrap up our conversation today. If anyone needs links, Freia's email, these are in the chat records for everyone to see. And thank you so much for attending today's wonderful presentation. We hope to see you again in the future.
Bye.